Imagine standing on a riverbank in northern Wisconsin, April 1895. The snow is melting, the ice is cracking, and somewhere upstream, 10 million logs are waiting to move. The river in front of you is barely 3 feet deep in most places. In summer, you could wade across it without getting your belt wet. Children splash in the shallows. Women wash clothes on the gravel bars. But right now, for the next 2 to 4 weeks, this trickle of water is about to become the most dangerous highway in America. The men gathering on the banks know what's coming. Some of them won't survive it. Last year, the Chippewa took 3. The year before, the Menominee took 2 more. These rivers have names the workers gave them, names that don't appear on any map. The Widowmaker, Dead Man's Bend, Bone Alley. Names earned in blood over decades of driving timber down waters that were never meant to carry it. But the logs have to move. The sawmills downriver are waiting. The cities are growing. Chicago needs lumber to build tenements. St. Louis needs timber for factories. Minneapolis needs wood for everything. And there's only one way to transport 10 million logs when there are no roads, no trucks, and no railroads reaching into the deep timber country. You float them down rivers that have no business carrying anything heavier than a canoe. This is the story of the spring drives, the forgotten logistics miracle that built American cities, and the men who died making it happen. To understand why anyone would attempt to float millions of logs down rivers that were barely navigable, you need to understand what America looked like in the mid-1800s. The white pine forests of the upper Midwest were the largest concentration of timber the world had ever seen. Trees 200 feet tall, trunks 6 feet across, enough lumber to rebuild every city on the eastern seaboard 10 times over, enough wood to frame 1 million homes, enough raw material to fuel an industrial revolution. The trees grew so thick in places that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Men who walked into those woods described a cathedral silence. The air smelled of pine resin. The ground was soft with centuries of accumulated needles. These forests had been growing since before Europeans set foot on the continent. Some of the oldest trees had started as seedlings when Columbus was still alive. The problem was getting it out. These forests sat in some of the most remote wilderness on the continent. No roads, no railroads, nothing but rivers that froze solid in winter and dropped to ankle depth by July. The nearest sawmill might be 100 miles downstream. The nearest market might be 500 miles beyond that. But those rivers flowed in the right direction, south and east, toward the sawmills, toward the cities, toward the money. The logging companies did the math. A single white pine log could weigh 2,000 pounds or more. A teamster with horses could haul maybe 5 logs per day over rough terrain. The horses needed feed. The teamster needed wages. The roads, such as they were, turned to mud in spring and dust in summer. At that rate, it would take decades to move the timber. By the time you finished, the cities would have built with brick and stone instead. But water moves for free. A river doesn't need wages, doesn't need feed, doesn't stop for rain or mud. It just flows, day and night, carrying whatever you put in it. The only question was how to make rivers that were barely 3 feet deep carry logs that drew 2 feet of water. The answer came from men who understood that you don't need a deep river if you know how to cheat. The engineering that made spring drives possible began months before any log touched water. All winter, logging crews worked in the frozen forests. They felled trees with cross-cut saws and double-bit axes. They limbed the fallen giants, stripping away branches that could snag on rocks downstream. They cut the trunks into 16-foot lengths, the standard measure that sawmills were built to handle. And they stamped each log with the company brand, a symbol hammered into the end grain that identified ownership. Then they moved the logs to the riverbanks. Teams of horses dragged them over ice roads, paths packed with snow and sprayed with water to create a slick surface. A good ice road could move logs for miles. A bad one could kill horses when the surface gave way. By March, the landings along the upper river looked like wooden cities. Logs stacked 20 feet high, millions of board feet waiting for the ice to break. You could walk along the river and see nothing but timber, walls of it, mountains of it, more wood than you could count in a lifetime. But the logs couldn't move until the river was ready. And making the river ready was its own form of engineering. Wing dams came first. These were structures built from logs and rocks that jutted out from the riverbank at an angle, like the letter V pointing downstream. Their purpose was simple: concentrate the flow. A river 3 feet deep spread across 100 feet of width doesn't have enough power to move anything. The current is too slow, the pressure too diffuse. But that same water forced into a channel 30 feet wide suddenly has current. It has push. It has the ability to carry weight. The physics are basic. Same volume of water, smaller space, faster flow. Work crews spent weeks building wing dams at every wide, shallow stretch of river. Log by log, rock by rock, working in water that was barely above freezing. Hands numb, feet soaked, creating artificial channels where the water would run deep enough to float timber. The work was brutal. Men stood in the shallows for hours, positioning logs, piling rocks. The cold ate into their bones. Frostbite was common. Pneumonia was common. But the work had to be done before the ice went out, or the drive would fail before it started. Then came the rearing dams. These were the real engineering marvels. Massive wooden structures built across streams and tributaries upstream of the main drive. They held back water, created artificial reservoirs, stored the snow melt until the logging company was ready to use it. Some of these dams were 100 feet across, built from squared timbers, chinked with moss and mud to hold back the flow. They had gates, wooden panels that could be raised or lowered to control the release. A good rearing dam could hold back millions of gallons, could turn a trickle into a flood at the throw of a lever. When the drive started, crews would open the gates on these rearing dams in sequence. The water would rush downstream in waves. Artificial freshets that raised the river level 2 or 3 feet for hours at a time, long enough to float logs over gravel bars that would have stopped them cold in normal flow. Time the releases right, and you could keep the river running high for the entire 2 to 4 week drive window. You could move logs down waters that physics said shouldn't carry them. You could make rivers do things they were never meant to do. Time them wrong, and your logs would be sitting on gravel bars until next spring. A year's work, a year's investment. Stranded because someone opened a gate too early or too late? The men who operated the rearing dams were calculating water levels before computers existed. They watched the snowpack, felt the temperature, knew that a warm night meant faster melt. A cold snap meant the window was shrinking. They passed down knowledge from father to son, wrote nothing down, trusted experience over theory. They were hydrology engineers who had never heard the word hydrology. They learned from watching, from failing, from finding out the hard way that a river doesn't care about your schedule. The timing of a spring drive was everything, and the window was brutally narrow. Too early, and the river was still locked in ice. Logs would pile up against ice jams, creating pressure that could shatter dam structures and destroy a winter's worth of work. The ice could hold for weeks after the air warmed, could fool you into thinking the river was ready when it wasn't, could crush your logs between frozen walls. Too late, and the snow melt was finished. The river would drop, logs would ground out on sandbars, and stay there until the following year. Once a log was stranded, there was no getting it out. The water wouldn't come back. The sun would bake the exposed timber. By the following spring, it would be worthless. The sweet spot was typically 2 to 4 weeks, sometimes less. A hot spring could compress the window to 10 days. A late cold snap could stretch it to 6 weeks. The logging foreman had to make the call based on experience, instinct, and prayer. He would walk the river in the days before the drive, check the ice, feel the water temperature with bare hands, look at the sky for signs of weather coming, listen to the old-timers who remembered what past springs had brought, and then he would decide, today. We go today. When the call came, everything happened fast. Crews called the bankmen would scramble along the riverbanks, rolling logs into the water with peavies. A peavy is a long wooden handle with a steel spike and a swinging hook at the end. It's the tool that defined river driving. Simple, brutal, effective. A man with a peavy could grab a 2,000-pound log and spin it like a toy. The logs hit the water and immediately started moving. Not in neat rows, not in organized formations. They tumbled. They spun. They collided with each other. They piled up against every rock, every bend, every obstruction the river threw at them. Chaos. Controlled chaos, if you were lucky. Uncontrolled disaster, if you weren't. This is where the river drivers earned their money. River drivers were the elite of the logging industry. They were paid double what a woods worker earned, and they were worth every penny. $2 a day when regular loggers made one, plus food, plus whatever reputation they could build. Their job was to ride the drive, walk on floating logs, jump from timber to timber in rapids, keep the logs moving downstream no matter what. The basic physics of the work sound impossible. A log floating in moving water is not stable. It rolls, it bobs, it responds to every ripple and current. Standing on one is difficult. Walking on one is dangerous. Doing it for 12 hours a day in 40-degree water while carrying a peavey is something else entirely. River drivers developed a signature walk. Weight low, knees bent, feet constantly adjusting, arms out for balance, eyes always moving, reading the water, feeling the log. They could sense a roll starting before it happened, could shift their weight to counter it, could keep their footing when physics said they should fall. They could read water the way sailors read wind, could tell by the ripples where rocks lurked beneath the surface, could see the current lines that showed where the flow was fastest, could feel through the soles of their boots when a log was about to roll out from under them. Their boots were specialized, called caulk boots or cork boots. The soles were studded with metal spikes that bit into wet wood. Short spikes, maybe half an inch, but sharp as needles. Without those spikes, a driver would last about 30 seconds before sliding off a spinning log into the current. With them, he might last a season. The current itself was the constant enemy. Spring rivers ran fast. The snow melt added volume and velocity. A man who fell in faced hypothermia within minutes. The water was barely above freezing. It sapped heat from your body faster than your body could make it. Even strong swimmers couldn't fight the current for long. The cold made your muscles lock up, made your lungs seize. And if you went under near a mass of moving logs, the timber would crush you against the first obstruction. Logs don't slow down for men in the water. They just keep coming. Thousands of pounds of wet wood, moving with the current, smashing into whatever gets in the way. The drivers worked in crews of 30 to 50 men. They spread out along the river, stationed at the trouble spots, the bends, the narrows, the places where the river wanted to jam, each man responsible for his stretch. Each man knowing that if he missed a hang-up, the men behind him would pay for it. Their job was to keep everything moving. Spot the log that was starting to hang up. Wade into the shallows. Use the peavey to spin it free before it caught another log, then another, then 100 more. They called the good drivers catty, nimble, quick. The kind of men who could dance on rolling logs like they were walking on solid ground. Men who seemed to know what the river wanted before the river knew it. The bad drivers didn't last long enough to get nicknames. Log jams were the nightmare that haunted every spring drive. Picture it. A single log catches on a rock. Maybe it's angled wrong. Maybe the water pushes it sideways. Maybe it's just bad luck. But it stops. And the log behind it bumps into it. Then another, and another. Within minutes, hundreds of logs are piling up. Within hours, thousands. The river is blocked from bank to bank, logs stacked 20 feet high, the pressure building with every new log that arrives from upstream. You can hear a jam forming before you see it. The grinding of wood on wood, the cracking of timber under stress, the roar of water backing up, looking for a way through. It sounds like a living thing, an animal in pain. A major jam could back up millions of board feet of timber, could stretch for a quarter mile, could trap so much water behind it that when it finally broke, the flood would destroy everything downstream. Bridges, dams, mills, towns. A jam letting go was one of the most destructive forces in the American woods. The men who broke these jams were called jam breakers. It was the most dangerous job in the American woods. More dangerous than felling trees. More dangerous than working the sawmills. More dangerous than anything except underground mining. Jam breakers had life expectancies measured in seasons, not years. The technique for breaking a jam started with reading it. Somewhere in that tangled mass of timber was a key log, the one that everything else was resting on. Find that log, free it, and the whole jam might release. Miss it, and you could work for days without making progress. Jam breakers would climb out onto the pile, logs shifting under their feet, the sound of wood grinding against wood filling the air, the whole mass creaking and groaning as the water pressure built behind it. You could feel the jam moving, feel it wanting to let go, feel the tension of millions of pounds of wood and water waiting to release. They would work with peaveys first, trying to roll logs free, trying to shift the weight, trying to open a channel for the water to start moving through. Sometimes it worked. The key log would shift, the jam would shudder, the men would have seconds to run before the whole thing let go. Seconds. That was it. The jam would let go with a sound like thunder. Logs would shoot downstream like missiles. The backed up water would surge forward in a wall. Men who didn't run fast enough would be caught in it. Swept away. Crushed. When peaveys didn't work, they brought out the dynamite. Powder men would crawl out onto the jam, set charges, light fuses, and run. The explosions would blow holes in the mass, remove enough logs to break the structure's integrity. Let the river do the rest. The problem was timing. Light the fuse too long, and the jam might shift before the charge went off. You'd lose your dynamite and still have the jam. Light it too short, and you'd still be on the logs when they blew. There was no standard formula. Every jam was different. Every powder man had to make the call. The other problem was that jams didn't always break clean. Sometimes the explosion would release part of the jam while the rest held. Logs would shoot downstream like battering rams. Men in the water downstream had no warning, no chance. The logs moved faster than a man could swim. The Chippewa River saw some of the worst jam breaks in history. In 1867, a jam near Chippewa Falls held over 150 million board feet of timber. It stretched for nearly a mile. It took weeks to break. Crews worked around the clock. The sound of dynamite echoed off the bluffs day and night. 2 men died when a partial release caught them in the rapids below. Their names are lost now. Most of the men who died breaking jams were never recorded. They were river drivers, seasonal workers, often immigrants from Scandinavia, Ireland, French Canada. When they died, the company noted the loss of time and moved on. The tools of river driving were simple, but each one represented generations of refinement. The peavey was invented in the 1850s by a Maine blacksmith named Joseph Peavey. Before his design, drivers used cant hooks, which had no spike on the end. The spike changed everything. It let drivers stab into a log, hold it, turn it, control it. A good driver with a peavey could maneuver a 2,000-pound log with precision, could spin it in place, could walk it across the current like a dog on a leash. Pike poles came next, longer than peaveys, with a simple spike at the end, used for reaching, for pushing, for the moments when you couldn't get close enough to use a peavey. A pike pole might be 20 feet long, could reach logs that were out in the main current, could push a jam from a safe distance, if any distance on a log drive could be called safe. The Wanigan was the heart of every drive. It was a floating bunkhouse and kitchen built on a flatboat hull that followed the logs downstream. The cook worked on board, while the Wanigan crew poled and paddled to keep pace with the drive. Everything the men needed came from the Wanigan: food, dry clothes, medical supplies, such as they were, coffee, whiskey when the foreman looked the other way. Meals on the Wanigan were legendary. River drivers burned thousands of calories a day working in cold water. They ate accordingly: salt pork by the pound, beans cooked for hours in cast iron pots, biscuits heavy enough to anchor a boat, pie when the cook felt generous, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. A cook who couldn't satisfy hungry drivers didn't last. The work was too hard. The men were too desperate. Good food was the only comfort in a job that offered none. At night, the drivers would pull out of the river and camp on shore or sleep in the Wanigan. Wet clothes hung by the fire, muscles aching, cuts and bruises from a day of hard labor, every man knowing that tomorrow brought more of the same, and the day after that, until the logs were delivered or the river dropped. The drives ran 7 days a week until the logs were delivered. There were no weekends on a spring drive, no holidays. The window was too narrow. The money was too important. Sundays looked like Mondays. Easter looked like any other day. Not all log transport was driving. There was another method, rafting. And the distinction mattered. Driving meant loose logs floating downstream. Millions of individual pieces of timber moving with the current, tended by drivers who kept them moving. Chaos managed by muscle and skill. Rafting meant logs bound together into floating platforms. Massive structures that could carry cargo and passengers. That could basteered. That could navigate bigger water without constant attention. The great log rafts of the Mississippi were engineering achievements in their own right. Logs would be bound together with chains and wooden crosspieces to create rafts covering acres of river surface, multiple cribs linked together, to oar crews at the front and back to steer, the whole assembly drifting downstream toward sawmills in cities like St. Louis and Memphis. Some of these rafts were enormous, 2 acres of floating timber, carrying cabins for the crew, carrying cook stoves and supplies for the weeks-long journey, carrying families of the raftsmen. Children grew up on log rafts, played on decks of floating timber while their fathers steered toward market. The journey could take weeks. St. Louis was over 500 miles from the upper Wisconsin timber country. The rafts drifted at the speed of the current, 3 or 4 miles an hour on a good day, less when the wind blew upstream. The oarsmen worked in shifts, day and night, keeping the massive structures in the channel away from sandbars, clear of bridge pilings. At night, the rafts floated on. The river didn't stop for darkness. Lanterns hung from poles at the bow and stern. Watchmen strained their eyes for obstacles. The sound of water rushing past the logs filled the darkness. Men slept in shifts, trusting their lives to whoever was steering. Rafting was safer than driving. The logs couldn't roll out from under you. The current couldn't sweep you away as easily. The work was still hard, but it didn't carry the same mortality rate. A man could raft for decades. A driver was lucky to last 5 years. The problem was that rafting required bigger water. You couldn't raft logs down a river that was barely 3 feet deep. You needed the main stems, the big rivers, the waters that had room for structures 100 feet wide. Spring drives fed the rafts. The logs would come down the small tributaries loose, tended by drivers. They'd reach the bigger water and be caught at sorting booms. These were chains stretched across the river, anchored to shore, that stopped the logs and held them for processing. Crews would sort the logs by company brand, separate them into rafts, bind them together. Then the rafts would continue downstream. It was a supply chain before anyone used that term. Timber cut in the remote forests of Wisconsin, driven down shallow creeks that shouldn't have been navigable, caught at sorting booms on the bigger rivers, rafted to sawmills hundreds of miles downstream, milled into lumber, shipped by rail to cities, built into homes and businesses and churches. The lumber that built Chicago came down these rivers. So did the lumber that rebuilt it after the Great Fire. And so did the timber that framed houses from Minnesota to Missouri to points beyond. All of it passing through waters that were 3 feet deep and filled with men who knew they might not survive the season. The mortality rates for river driving are impossible to calculate precisely. The companies didn't keep reliable records. Many drivers were itinerant workers, hired for a single season. They drifted in from other jobs, drifted out when the drive ended. When they died, their absence was noted, but rarely investigated. What we know comes from fragments, local newspaper reports, company correspondence that survived, the memories of old-timers recorded decades later by historians who sensed the era was ending. The Chippewa River system probably killed more drivers than any other. The water ran fast. The terrain was unforgiving. The jams formed in places where breaking them meant certain danger. The company records that survive show deaths almost every season, some years more than others, but never zero. A medical examiner's report from Eau Claire in 1889 notes 17 drownings connected to logging operations in a single season. 17 men in one county, in 1 year, on one river system. Think about that. 17 families got news that a husband or a father or a son wasn't coming home. 17 funerals, 17 graves, in one county, in 1 year. Across the industry, across all the rivers, across the decades of the great drives, the number of dead probably runs into the thousands. Men whose names we'll never know. Whose graves, if they have graves, are unmarked. Whose only memorial is the lumber they helped deliver. The survivors carried the marks of the work, missing fingers from PV accidents, scarred legs from caulk boot wounds, damaged lungs from years of working in cold water, hearing loss from the constant roar of rapids, joints that ached when the weather changed, and the psychological weight, the friends lost, the close calls survived, the knowledge that the river didn't care if you lived or died, that it would just keep flowing, that the logs would keep coming, that the work would go on with or without you. The spring drives created their own culture, their own language, their own way of seeing the world. A good stretch of river was called a fair run. A dangerous stretch was a bad piece. A log that kept hanging up was a maverick. A driver who talked too much was tongue-tied to his teeth. A coward was river-shy. A good man was true river. The men had songs, ballads about famous drives, about men who died, about rivers that took more than they gave. The melodies borrowed from Irish and Scottish traditions. The words were pure timber country. Songs about the Chippewa and the Menominee and the St. Croix. Songs that named rivers like enemies, like lovers, like gods. They had rituals. A drink before the drive started. A longer drink when it ended. Fights that settled grudges built up over months in the woods. Competitions to see who could stay on a rolling log the longest. Burling, they called it. Log rolling. 2 men on one log trying to spin each other into the water. When the drive ended and the logs were delivered, the drivers scattered. Some went back to the woods to work the summer season. Some drifted to other jobs. Some spent their pay in the river towns and were broke within a week. The towns knew when a drive was finished. The saloons stayed open all night. The smart ones saved. The lucky ones survived long enough to quit. The rest kept coming back, year after year, until the rivers took them or the industry changed. The end came gradually, then all at once. Trucks arrived first. By the 1910s, logging companies were experimenting with motorized transport. The early trucks were unreliable. The roads were terrible. Ruts that swallowed axles, mud that stopped engines, bridges that couldn't hold the weight, but trucks didn't care about snowmelt. Didn't need a 2-week window, could haul timber year-round, could go where rivers didn't flow, could reach timber that water could never touch. Roads followed the trucks. The same civilian Conservation Corps crews that built trails in national parks also built logging roads into the backcountry. Suddenly, the timber wasn't trapped in remote wilderness. It was accessible. By road, by truck, by technology that didn't depend on spring floods. Railroads pushed deeper into the forests. Narrow gauge lines that could reach places the main stems never went. Logs could be loaded onto cars and shipped directly to mills. No driving, no rafting, no drowning, no waiting for the ice to break, no praying for the snowmelt to last. The industry did the math again. Trucks and trains cost money to operate, but they didn't lose 10% of their logs to river hazards. They didn't require armies of seasonal workers. They didn't depend on the weather cooperating for 2 weeks every April. They were predictable, controllable, safe. Safe for the workers, safe for the investment, safe for the insurance companies that were starting to ask questions about mortality rates. The last great drives happened in the 1920s and 1930s. Wisconsin's final large-scale drive was in 1927 on the Chippewa, the same river that had carried more timber than any other. The same river that had taken more lives than any other. It ended not with ceremony, but with economics. Maine held on longer, with drives continuing until 1934 on the Penobscot. The old ways died hard in Maine. The rivers ran through terrain that resisted roads. But eventually even Maine surrendered. Some smaller operations continued even later. The last recorded commercial log drive in the continental United States was on the Clearwater River in Idaho in 1971. A small operation, a handful of men. An echo of what had been. Newspapers sent reporters to cover it. They knew they were watching the end of something. By then, the environmental damage was impossible to ignore. Rivers that had carried billions of board feet of timber were choked with bark and debris. Stream beds were scoured down to bedrock. Fish populations had collapsed. Salmon that once ran thick couldn't survive in waters clogged with woody debris. Brook trout that had fed generations of indigenous peoples vanished from streams they had inhabited for millennia. The bark was the worst of it. Every log that traveled downriver left behind strips of bark. Millions of logs meant billions of strips. The bark accumulated on the river bottom. It decayed, it consumed oxygen, it turned living streams into dead zones where nothing could survive. Some rivers ran brown with tannic acid for decades after the last drive. The wing dams and rearing dams had altered hydrology in ways that took decades to repair. Rivers didn't flow naturally anymore. They flowed the way the logging companies had trained them, and now that the logging was done, they didn't know how to heal. The artificial channels eroded banks that had been stable for centuries. The altered flows changed where sediment deposited, creating new sandbars in some places, scouring away beaches in others. Most states banned river driving entirely by the 1960s. The practice that had built American cities was now illegal. Too destructive, too dangerous, too much a relic of an era that valued timber over everything else. Stand on the bank of the Chippewa today, and you'll find a gentle river. Canoeists paddle it in summer. Fishermen cast for smallmouth bass. The water runs clear over gravel bars that once held logs stacked 20 feet high. There are no wing dams anymore, no rearing dams, no sorting booms stretched across the current. The structures that made the drives possible rotted away decades ago. Their timbers are buried in river silt, or long since carried downstream to the Gulf of Mexico. In a few places, you can still find the marks. Iron rings set in shoreline rocks where boom chains once anchored. Caulk boot scars on boulders where drivers scrambled for footing. Place names that remember what happened. Dead Man's Slough, Widow's Bend, Broken Bone Rapids. Names that tourists don't understand. Names that tell stories if you know how to listen. The men who worked these rivers are all gone now. The last of the river drivers died decades ago. Their stories went with them mostly. A few accounts survive in local historical societies, in collections of logging photographs that show young men standing on floating logs, peaveys in hand, looking at the camera like they know they're being recorded for history. They were young mostly. You can see it in the photographs. Early 20s, strong backs, clear eyes. They didn't know they were building a country. They just knew the pay was good and the work was steady. They built the country anyway. The lumber they moved became the homes of the Midwest, the churches of the plains, the factories of the industrial age. Every board that came down those rivers represented someone's labor, someone's risk, someone's possible death. We don't build that way anymore. The economics don't support it. The environmental costs are too high. The liability is unthinkable. No insurance company would cover a spring drive today. No workers' compensation fund could handle the claims. But there's something worth remembering in how they did it. 10 million logs in a river 3 feet deep. It shouldn't have worked. The physics said no. The geography said impossible. The reasonable approach would have been to wait for better technology. Wait for the railroads. Wait for the trucks. Wait for someone else to solve the problem. They didn't wait. They built wing dams and rearing dams. They invented techniques for walking on rolling logs. They developed a timing system based on snowmelt and temperature. They created an industry that moved more timber than any railroad could have handled. They made impossible things happen through will and skill and a willingness to die trying. And they died doing it. Not in industrial accidents that made headlines, not in disasters that sparked reforms. They died one at a time, in cold water, on spring mornings, while the logs kept floating, and the foreman kept pushing, and the mills kept waiting. The spring drives lasted roughly 60 years as a major industry. From the 1860s through the 1920s, one human lifetime, 2 generations of workers. In that lifetime, they denuded the great pine forests of the upper Midwest, stripped Maine and New Hampshire of their old growth, transformed wilderness into lumber towns, and lumber towns into ghost towns when the timber ran out, created fortunes for men who never touched a peavey, created graves for men whose names were never recorded. Was it progress? The cities grew, the country expanded, the homes got built. The newspapers printed on paper, made from pulp that came down these rivers, wrote editorials about manifest destiny and American greatness. Was it cost? The men who drowned, the forests that disappeared, the rivers that were damaged for generations, the indigenous peoples whose lands were cut over without consent or compensation. Both things are true. That's the uncomfortable reality of industrial history. The spring drives were an achievement and a tragedy, an engineering marvel and an ecological disaster, a source of honest wages and a graveyard for working men. We can hold both truths at once. We can admire the ingenuity while mourning the cost. We can learn from the methods while rejecting the values that treated men and forests as expendable resources. The next time you're in an old house, the kind with original woodwork, is the kind with wide pine boards in the floors. Run your hand along the wood. That lumber came from somewhere. It was cut by someone. It was moved by someone else. It traveled down rivers that were barely navigable, tended by men who walked on rolling logs in 40-degree water. Those men had names, had families, had lives beyond the river. They weren't statistics. They weren't background characters in the story of American expansion. They were workers who did a job that killed people, and they did it anyway because the pay was good and the alternatives were worse. The lumber industry didn't celebrate them. The history books barely mention them. The rivers they worked have forgotten their footsteps. But the wood remembers. Every board that came down those shallow rivers carries the marks of its journey. The scars where peaveys bit in, the gouges where logs collided, the grain patterns that show how fast the tree grew and how old it was when it fell. Put your hand on that wood. Feel the surface. Know that someone risked their life to get it here. That's the debt we owe. Not to the timber industry, not to the lumber barons who got rich, to the men on the logs, the drivers and the jam breakers, the bankmen and the powder men. They moved 10 million logs down rivers that were 3 feet deep, and too many of them never made it home. If you made it this far, you understand something about how this country was built. Not just the grand achievements, the hard labor underneath. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Next week, I'm covering another piece of industrial history that most people have forgotten. The work that built the world we inherited. I'll see you then.